PL Python 10, 310, and V8, PL V8 running. So I'm happy with the result. I'm thinking a lot about implementation these days. So let me give you an idea of what I have in mind for agenda. What is the base implementation I need for being able to do recursive nodes? And I'm realizing it can be done with almost a single level of indirection. That is, if I have, I always build frames as objects. The relation, the slots of the frames are triples, I guess. You know, frame, slot name, value. I essentially get something that behaves like a recursive hypergraph because I can always refer to a frame in a frame. Good in theory. The only downside is I need a way, and this is really important, to refer to a frame slot value, which in this scheme doesn't have its own identity, but the frame has an identity, the slot name has an identity, as long as we're not speaking about multiple values, it's well-defined enough. And I realized this is really important, and we're going back to CDL considerations up to a point. It's any, I was thinking, I kept speaking about the distinction between entities and claims, and I realized in a way, if frames are the center of the universe or the basic building block, of course a claim is a frame, but an entity is also how should I put it? An entity is a frame slot variable. Like I'm saying, that which plays that role in this frame. And including, at the most basic level, the naming frame. This entity has that name. This is the kind of the semiotic relation entity, if you will. And then you say this entity has that name, and you've created an entity as a frame slot position. And then it's all about variable unification. Like if you think of frame slot as a variable, like that which fills that frame, that X which fills that frame. And when a frame refers to another, you need to do the variable unification between the two frames, right? Because you need to say this actor in this slot is the same as this actor in this slot in the referred subframe, right? So if entities are actors in the naming frame, you've got, it's all frames. There's no entities as a separate object. All you have is frames, which are claims. Actors, like entities, are frame variables, if you will. You have variable unification as a basic construct, and then entities come up from naming. Now, that does not solve the many-to-many problem of, you know, I name something, I'm creating a variable, and then later on it's discovered to be ambiguous, and there's these two entities. And how do I say, well, this frame, which was using this naming variable, now I have to say, well, it's actually using this new version, which is less ambiguous, and so on and so forth. So that remains a problem, or at least a key necessity. But making the frames as primitives and making the variable unification as primitive, I think, has a lot of promise in terms of representing the kind of complex claims we're talking about and the difficulties between the claim unification. The last thing that bothers me a bit with this is that we keep speaking about making claims non-indexical. And really what's happening is we're equating, we're kind of making sure that all the frame slots are filled with name references, some of which may be filled with context, but we're trying to say, okay, this is, and this is this entity, this named entity, this named entity. So we're using named entities as a way to make the frame less indexical. But if, I wonder how, quote unquote, realistic it is to make the frame absolutely non-indexical, because there's always going to be either interpretations, ambiguity, or very small discrepancies. I'll give a specific example and I'll let you go. Things such as, and here we get more into the problem that Tim raised with the values such as the lockdown will cost more, or climate change will cause this problem soon. Well, what does soon mean? It depends on date of publication. It depends on time frame. It depends, and a lot of that is vague, probably on purpose. And unifying such things is going to be extremely difficult. On the other hand, if we say, well, this is a range and there's so much overlap between ranges, like from time of publication to some arbitrary value, maybe we can speak about unification, which is not perfect, but approximate fields.
It's only a problem when you're thinking in fully formalized data, right?
Correct.
Because if you're not, then it's just strings.
Absolutely.
So what you're talking, so the question for you is, how do you model fully formalized indexical claims?
Correct.
Right?
Correct.
Yeah.
Correct.
So what kind of frame, or like what is this indexical entity that is unclear, and then this kind of stuff?
Yeah. And unification with unclear, with vague entities is always going to be a problem, no matter what. I'm just saying this makes the problem more obvious and more glaring. Formalization makes the problem more obvious and more glaring. But I'm curious just to have your reaction to the idea of using naming frames and variable unification as fundamental.
Yeah, I mean, it's basically the same as I did in Woost 3 in this prototype thing.
Right.
At that point, I called it topic, and the alignment was called binding. But it's essentially the same idea, right?
I think you are right. Let me see. The question is, sometimes we want to bind not to an entity, but to a variable. And I'm not sure. Okay, the question is, if we're creating an entity with each frame, right? Or many entities, one per role, which I think is the case. But,
With entity, you mean database entity?
No, I mean something we talk about, a topic that way. Yeah. And then, okay, I'm saying there's less entities than entity variables. Or right?
Yeah.
What I'm saying is, when we're creating a frame, we're creating entity formula, like that entity which fulfills this claim. And when we're putting many frames together in a complex stream, like a document, or many, like each frame restricts, like places further through entity unification. We're saying this and this and this role variables are the same entity, step one. And hence we're placing more and more constraints on which concepts or real world beings can fulfill this variable, which is common to many frames. So each frame creates a entity formula, but entity formula are not entities. There's much more entity formula than entities is what I'm trying to say. And which is fine. I'm trying to make that distinction between the entity formula and the entity itself.
Yeah, it's kind of like, yeah, I mean, I had a similar concept with which I called schema. It's probably something different because I wanted to use it as, say, like, claim the schema, like entities in an entities relationship model are schemas in my version. But what you're referring to sounds like you want to model frames with holes and the instances of these frames with the filled holes, right? Is that what you're talking about?
Up to a point. What I'm saying, no, there's the frame schema, which is something else, but there's even an actual statement, which is a frame instance, right? I'm saying Jill gave the bag to Jack, right? Jill gave the ball to Jack. Here, it's assumed that Jill, Jack, and the ball, and not a ball, are well-defined entities in the context and could be tied to specific entities. Maybe not. Maybe I'm in a context where this is a children's book and Jill and Jack are not people, but abstraction of people, right? It's most likely the interpretation of that utterance, by the way, but let's not go there. Let's suppose Jill and Jack and the ball are well identified. Okay, but there's still, what's the exact time it happened? What form? There's all these things that are left vague. There's always holes in a statement. It's fine. On the other hand, there is this notion that it did happen at a specific time. There's this notion, there exists a time that fulfills this frame exactly. We don't know it. It's not specified. It's not mentioned, but it exists. So in that way, there's a variable, which is the time variable. When did this happen? And then later on, I'll say, oh, and after that, Jack hugged Jill. So again, time is unspecified, but we know there's a constraint of after that. So there's a constraint between two unspecified time moments. So here I'm creating, there's holes, but the holes are formula. There exists an X such that it fulfills this frame. It's really propositional calculus here type of thing. And if I say simultaneously something else happened, then I'm creating constraint between the two variables. It's a form of variable unification. Now there's much less, like if I take each sentence simultaneously, each sentence defines holes or filled holes for each of their slots. But if I look at the interaction or document or stream as a whole, I find that there's much less variables than the total number of holes because there's unification, obvious. What is a bit less obvious is that I could have, I could speak at the moment of the giver of the ball or the player in that game or blah, blah, blah. These are many holes which are not clearly unified, but which for other reasons happen to be the same person. So in general, I'm saying there's less entities than entity holes. And at some point, I want to speak of all the possible entities that could fill that holes versus this entity trying to fill that hole. And they're different things, right? And what I'm saying is, as I'm accumulating statements, in one statement, there's many entities that could potentially fill a given hole, but as you add statements, you're adding constraints. So the number of actual otherwise known entities that could fill that hole shrinks because the constraints tighten the space of entities that could fulfill all those constraints. Now, those actual entities that can fill the entity hole, what I'm saying is there's a difference between the entity and the entity hole range, if you will, which is what we're defining with the claim. With the claim, we're defining entity hole range. And then we're saying this entity actually fits that formula.
Sounds like a type.
Almost, yeah. Almost. I see what you're saying. Is that true? Possibly. Yeah, each frame creates type constraints. I would not have thought about it that way, but that may be right. But what I'm saying is the bottom line of that way of thinking, though I like it a lot, is that if I'm thinking of what does this statement mean, well, in context, there's all these constraints that come from the context that say this entity has to be this one, not that one, this one, like all the extra constraints. So that means if I want to take this this claim and isolate it and make it non-indexical, in theory, I'd have to bring all the constraints from all the surrounding claims, which is as bad as keeping it in context, right? Unless there's enough constraints that we can identify it uniquely, which can happen, but it's not necessarily the case, right? Sometimes there's enough context that we can say it is this individual, and there's a well-defined outside individual. If it's a concept, that's much less likely because concepts are not individuals, they're more Protean. So that means when we're speaking about a concept, we're bringing all the constraints and how much we can isolate it from its context when assessing its meaning is still problematic to me.
Okay, wait, yes, you have some terms here now, like concept, entity, frame.
Okay, concept as in abstract entity.
Okay.
As opposed to, there's an entity, like maybe you or me or Tim. And once we fix that, we're pretty much done, right? Of course, there's still variation. Do you mean me now or me as in 5 years ago? And this can be a slightly different person, yada, yada. There's still uncertainty even there. But still, it's much more better understood to be an individual than something like climate change, where there's as many ideas about climate change as there are people, almost. And so if I take climate change has this characteristic from this text and from that text, it's not the same climate change. Now, the question is, what are the key constraints that really help define the concept in various
it sounds
clusters?
Like that concepts are literals of the system, basically, right? The atomic units. And if you want to, and they get defined by attaching information.
What I'm saying is you can use it as a literal, but there's this many-to-many relationship between the concept and what defining constraints it carries with it, right?
Yeah, and I'm saying like these vary over time. These get more formalized or whatever,
exactly.
And they get attached to this core identity of the concept. But that's why I said like the concepts will sound like these are the atoms.
Yeah, but the concept is not the literal. Like the literal is in many-to-many relationship with the concepts. Again, hammering that again and again. The constraints get attached indeed to the concepts, which may be represented by a literal. But when you have a literal like climate change, it will probably correspond to many different concepts.
All right. Okay. Yeah. Okay. Then literal is we had a different terminology. thought
Yeah,
I had
yeah,
a
yeah,
different
yeah,
idea
yeah.
of. No, I mean like the atomic unit. It's just,
Yeah,
that's what I was saying. Yeah.
and what I'm saying is when we have the text fragment, climate change in a document, what we have from the document is all the other claims about climate change, which are held to be true in the document, which create, okay, we're probably speaking about this climate change and that climate change, right? If they're, suppose they were well-defined and we had atomic concepts well-defined, then we could say from the document claims, I can say it's probably this one or maybe this one, but certainly not that one. But the problem is we're trying to define them as we go. That means we say, okay, not this one, and one of those. And then so we'll attach an interpretation and that concept will split and evolve. And then is it still valid? And blah, 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 blah. Like the interpretation. Now I know I'm not hearing from Tim. I'm curious about it. And I know his reaction will be, I don't care about what it means in context. What I keep saying is, I don't think it has any meaning outside of context. It's ambiguous outside of context.
Because you have a very broad definition of context, right?
Yeah.
In English language, for example.
Yes. And what I'm saying is, whenever the term is used, it's used in a context with other claims about the term that help narrow the term up to a point, but maybe not maximally. And
but until it's useful.
Until it's useful.
Good enough, yeah.
For that context. Mm-hmm. But it may not be good enough for another context. And that means when we unify, we're looking at a fuzzy set up to a point of, okay, it's probably one of those. And sorry, when we lift it out of its context, the making it non-indexical means from any one source, it has, here's a subset of the possible meanings that are plausible from this context. Here's a subset from this context. Here's a subset from this context. And now when we want to speak of it in an abstract, contextless way, and we want to make it non-indexical, what are we doing? Are we taking the intersection, the union of all these possible meanings for all of these? I think these are possibly different statements at a certain level. Like, for example, I would argue that the Earth is flat as a statement from, you know, for example, the Plains Indian, and I insist on Plains because they haven't seen ship go down on the horizon before Columbus, is not the same statement as somebody saying the Earth is flat now in full cognizance of the photo of the Earth from the moon. It's not the same kind. It's yes, ostensibly it has the same meaning, but answering a different set of evidence gives it a different meaning. Do you see what I'm saying? I'm being a bit going in many directions here, but
I mean, I don't see how that's relevant to the canonical debate question, because I guess it sounds like you're trying to pluck the sentence and assemble its meaning. And you're saying, well, it depends on who said the sentence and in what context they were in when they said it. And I'm saying that it's exactly irrelevant for the canonical debate, where the point is, in order for us to have a meaningful discussion, define each of these things. Pick your things before we start throwing out arguments, because otherwise we're wasting our time talking about different things. So if your concept of the Earth is these planes that you see here, let's define it as these planes that you see here. And obviously then the fact that satellites are flying overhead doesn't mean anything, but we're not talking about the same Earth here, right? Our definition for Earth is different.
No. I wasn't speaking about a different Earth. I was speaking about making that statement in a limited information versus denying information context. But it's the same. It's the same. It's the same intent to mean Earth, meaning the whole world we're standing on. It wasn't a limitation in the notion of Earth. It was a limitation of information available.
But isn't that the point of the debate, is to aggregate information? So everybody brings in a part of the picture and you complete it. And so I don't see the conflict there. I only see the conflict if you get different results based on what you meant by the Earth and by flat or whatever, right?
I see what you're saying, and that's not wrong. So maybe my example wasn't that good, but I do think that there are cases, and maybe I'll need to think more about cases, where, okay, I said at a philosophical level, that's not the same statement. I still think that's true. But it's true that that difference can be erased in the context of the canonical debate. Fine. I think there are cases where a statement will have different meaning depending on which entity you mean, as you pointed out. And that's the example you gave with Earth. And that will depend on context of usage. Now, what you're saying is I'm only concerned with cases where the entity pointed to is well defined.
Yeah, I wouldn't say only. It's just that your problem to me seemed to stem from where you're plucking it out of a context and trying to figure out the union of meanings of the word rather than explicitly setting those parameters.
Yeah, and you keep saying, so it's not relevant to canonical debate. And I keep saying, sorry, this is a discussion we've had many times. It's only because you're ignoring canonical debate as a context.
That's fine, but I only care about the canonical debate as a context for my design, right? For the problems I'm trying to solve.
No, what I'm saying is everything I say about context dependence applies to the canonical debate.
If somebody just says the Earth is flat and they haven't defined anything and you don't know who they are, you can have the debate. Go ahead. It will, in the canonical debate, without any added context or anything, result in what we've talked about with ambiguity, which is you'll inevitably have arguments whose relevance varies depending on how one interprets the words that were not defined, right? So each person is, in essence, bringing their own context.
Exactly.
Right, and I'm okay with that, right? And I don't see it as something that's designed into the system. I see it as something the system could reflect and kind of detect. But the goal of the system design would be to identify and remove those ambiguities so that you can come to some kind of conclusion or consensus on, you know.
Okay, I think let's start with that because I agree with that goal and that scope. You're saying the sentence is ambiguous, there's implicit context, and the idea is to make the implicit context explicit so that the conversation can be better defined. I think we're in alignment there. I'm proposing doing it from instances and documents and external things that I bring into the canonical debate, which is a slightly different use case, but it's just a case of making it less ambiguous. It's the same process coming from outside or coming from inside, coming from somebody inputting a sentence with the context left implicit in the canonical debate. It's the same process. We have to make the context explicit.
Yeah, let's break that down a little bit. There are different cases of that or different ways that can be done. I'm not sure how to organize this yet, but you know, so in the perspective of the canonical debate is a subset of a much larger system or an operating system. It's built on top of this larger operating system, right? then what you're saying is these concepts have already been defined, right? Somewhat. And so somebody's importing, and I don't know if in the larger operating system it's already considered a claim or not. I forgot the word you have for it. It's a topic, right? It's a sentence, a statement, or whatever it is that's been already there and imported into the context of the canonical debate. And with that would come whatever those concepts are, right? In that case, I would say it's been defined as defined already. I don't see a merging there. I don't see the problem of unifying because it's been plucked out of a context that theoretically already has it defined. And if it hasn't been defined,
yeah,
then
that's
it's
yet another case. Yet another
right.
case, not the one I meant, but yeah, that's also an interesting case. Then there's a question of how does the canonical debate system interact with concepts defined outside it, and unification of concept it already has defined and externally defined concepts. But that's all another discussion.
But let me talk about that a little bit right now, which is, okay. I'm more and more buying. I mean, already from the beginning, I bought that the idea of managing these concepts or entities and the relationships was outside the scope of the canonical debate. So it's a separate domain, right? I'm thoroughly convinced that, knowledge graphs are not sufficient for the needs of the canonical debate, which means there needs to be a system that is, or it needs to be built into the canonical debate. But, given that it's a separate domain and it could be used for other things you want to do, it makes sense to have a separate engine that provides all the concepts and manages the definition. The weird interaction is there's going to be debates about the definitions, right? And, the definitional claims and that sort of thing. So yep. I don't know where to draw a line. Maybe there's no line drawn except as needed for the context of canonical debate. So anyway, I'm fully open and accepting of that. And I'm very fascinated and interested in the design of definitions and how to manage them and debate them. And, more and more I'm buying into a lot of your ideas on it. I fear the complexity of it all.
Right. Yeah. So do I.
Yeah. So anyway, so there's that, in terms of pulling it in and coming from a specific context, like there's a type of claim that is, here's a place that made this statement or made this claim. And it's the interpretation claim that we were talking about, right?
Yep.
And my claim is that this claim meant this, right?
Yep.
And so that's a specific type of claim. And that's obviously something that shouldn't be supported by the canonical debate, because at any point you could say, when whatever person said this, they were trying to say this, or they were being racist, or they were showing how communist they are, or whatever,
No, absolutely. Interpretation is a fundamental building block. I think we agree with that. Good.
Yeah, I don't know if interpretation needs to be its own object, its own domain type. I don't know about the design of that yet.
It's a frame. Yeah. Like for me, it's all frames at this point. Frames all the way down.
Yeah, I don't understand frames enough yet to absorb that. So I have to learn more about them as we go. But at any rate, I am sure that there are some types of things that are maybe considered indexical. Like indexical to some degree is just did you replace a proper noun with a pronoun? But it's also like referring to that video, referring to that document, or referring to that thing, and that thing may be outside the system, but needs to be represented by a concept in the system that is part of the definition or the structure of the claim, right? And in that sense, I don't see a problem with replacing in the sentence a pronoun, the proper noun with a pronoun, as long as it's been defined then it's just how you're reading it.
And again, that's not a problem when it's a well-defined entity like a document or a person. It's more problematic when it's an abstract concept.
Well, as you said too, though, even a person changes over time. What is a person, right?
Yeah.
No, what do you do with a claim? I'm not the same Tim I was back then. That's a claim.
It's a claim. It's actually a very valid and accurate. It's a valid claim. It's a valid claim.
Yes.
Right. and it's true that when we say Tim said XYZ, what we mean is Tim of a certain moment. And there's probably a bit of fuzziness around which Tim said this. Meaning,
I mean, we definitely need to allow exactly, as with definitions, we need to allow as much ambiguity as possible, as humanly reasonable, so we don't spend all our time, specifying every single unnecessary point. Yeah. I'm in full agreement with all those things. The thing is, there are definitely claims. I guess this is what you mean by in the context of canonical debate. There are definitely claims that need to just come out of the blue and nobody knows where they came from, but let's debate it. And they've been assigned the concepts and everything. I guess that's where you're saying the context is the canonical debate. Okay.
Yeah.
I don't know if I see value in, for the purpose of the canonical debate, maintaining the original context for a claim that has been imported into the canonical debate, as long as it came with all those definitions and everything. In other words, as Stephen calls the complete representation is there and permanent, is the sort of thing where you should be able to come in and not have to look at the context it came from in order to start interacting usefully with the...
Okay, let's focus on this one, because this is what I was introducing. Oh, go ahead, Felix.
Yeah, this might be tricky, because when people talking about the moderators did this and this, and then you move that claim to another system, then the moderators something different. And that's where the context of the system, like the canonical debate, makes sense.
I don't know what moving a claim to another system would entail too. I don't
okay.
I don't know what you mean by that, because
if we're kind of designing like a protocol with many different argumentation systems exchanging claims, then this can happen.
Right, but then is it a move? Is it like a blockchain transfer, atomic transfer, where it doesn't exist anymore?
It's a reference. It's a cross-reference.
Is it a copy, or is it just like different interfaces with different permissions operating on the same entity? Right.
Yeah, it's cross-reference, and that means you need to carry a lot of the context with you. Okay, I was making 2 points. One is whether. Okay, on the one hand, when we have an ambiguous sentence with many possible interpretations, if we consider it in its original contexts, each context may have a way to restrict possible interpretation. And I'm saying for me, and maybe not for canonical debate, but for me, there is value in saying what interpretations are made in practice in various contexts, rather than thinking of all possible interpretations in the abstract without context, because I think this is a more bounded domain.
Let me map this now. It's like maybe what you're saying is, rather than requiring entities to be defined, a shorthand might be kind of default, and you're saying interpretations, but let's just say concepts, right, or topics. When you say the name of this person, you're obviously referring to somebody within that context of, right, Satoshi Nakamoto or whatever. You're referring to somebody that's in common use in that area. So without having to explicitly attach a definition, it's implicitly attached. And so,
or like Trump.
Yeah, it's not exactly what I was saying. I see why you relate it. It's not wrong, but it's a distinct thing. What I was saying was a bit different. What I was saying is, okay, we agree there's a process of narrowing interpretations of a sentence. We have a sentence. It may have come from a document. It may have been input in the system, in which case for me, CDL acts as a document as a whole, but it comes from somewhere. And as such, we don't have enough information. There's ambiguity, we detect ambiguity, we detect multiple possible interpretations. Like as humans, we read this and it's like, oh, it could mean this or that. And there's a process of reducing ambiguity, okay? It can exist purely in the abstract, where we say, here's a sentence, here's one possible interpretation, here's another, and we don't know. But when we attach arguments around it, let's attach it to the more specific one because the original one is too ambiguous. Okay, that's one process, and that's totally within canonical debate, I think. I'm saying there's a variant of that process.
Well, sort of. What's interesting is it's within the context of the canonical debate when the topic of the debate is X is interpretation. X meant Y when they said Z, right? That's a debate. But when there's just a claim that's undefined out there,
yeah, I would say,
I don't find it useful to say, oh, it came from that.
No, once again, I'm not there. Let's just forget provenance for a second. Let's just take the claim in the abstract and say what's useful for the canonical debate with claim in the abstract. And I'm claiming it's useful to do the distinction. Forget about saying so-and-so said, forget provenance. Just because at some point somebody will make a counterclaim or blah, 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 and they'll discuss relevance. And it will turn out that the relevance depends on interpretation. And then it will be worth breaking down the interpretation so that you can attach relevance, like it's high relevance for this interpretation and not for that one. And so that process is useful, even in the total abstract non-provenance case.
Right, and my approach to that again is to say it doesn't matter. I don't want it to be like, let's figure out interpretations. It's like, let's just make them separate claims. Here's a claim.
Sure.
With one interpretation, is it true or false? Here's another one, and here's another one.
No. But what I'm saying is the claim was entered a certain way. People start putting arguments, and people argue about relevance, and then it is realized that it was entered in an ambiguous way. So you want to refactor so that it becomes two unambiguous claims, and that's an interpretation process. That's what I'm talking about. So that the arguments can be attached to the proper unambiguous claim with better defined relevance. Right? And that is what I call the interpretation process, which I think is fully within your definition of canonical debate.
The difference, I think, is whether or not we're comfortable with losing some of the information along the way in the process. I'm very comfortable with losing all the process of how he got there.
I understand,
except for the fact that you don't want to lose history. But it's like
I would like to keep history, but that's another story. And the reason
I'd like to keep history because of the transparency and showing there's no censorship and trust, that sort of thing. But
but for me, there's another reason which I want to explain.
Right, that's what I'm saying. Is that other reason is to me very, very low priority for the canonical debate.
Fair enough. But we agree that there's this basic process of refactoring for disambiguation.
Yes.
That is not questioned. And what I'm saying is, if we have this ambiguous sentence, one thing I would be interested in doing, and maybe that's not a canonical debate thing, but something is in my scope, is then looking at provenance and looking at interpretation and practice to say, you know what, nobody actually ever has that interpretation. That interpretation is not found in any real context. So forget about it. Or you know,
straw man interpretation or something.
Straw man interpretation. So let's let's mark it as a fringe interpretation. And the other reason, so that's one thing. I think it's useful to compare with actual provenance.
Like I would see it useful as a claim. From the claim perspective, it'd be useful if it's like, you know, so and so is saying we interpret this way, but nobody does, right? That's a useful claim, right?
That's a useful claim. But it's also useful in the basic process of saying, is this relevant? No, because of that interpretation. Well, that's a straw man interpretation.
Right. And that gets into, like, from the canonical debate perspective, and this is the dangerous part that gets into, you know, scoring moderation, that sort of thing, gets into Felix's part, which is, I'm terrified of algorithms automatically determining what's more important and what isn't. And I know it's totally necessary. And that association would be very useful for that. I agree with that. Yes.
Yeah. And then the next step is we encounter that sentence again in another document. And we're like, okay, which one is meant in this context because it matters to supporting claims found in that document. And I want to know if the supporting claim are supporting this version or that version. And I want to, you know, use that to enrich the canonical debate, and having the trace that this was ambiguous, it was resolved as this one or that one, and maybe here's how we may know which one is likely to have been used in the document because of defining characteristics, which allow me to narrow down the interpretation. And then I know that supporting claims coming from the document are addressing this interpretation and not that one. So for me, it's all part of the same thing.
I see. Yeah. Mm-hmm. Right.
Okay. Now that I've made that generic point as why I care about provenance and why I still think it's relevant to the canonical debate problem space, even if you choose to a more narrow interpretation, which is entirely valid. But I think it's relevant to the problem space of the canonical debate for all the reasons I've given. The problem I was raising from there is suppose we have provenance, and now we're back in my scope rather than yours. And we're saying, okay, I've got this thing coming from there, and I want to make it non-indexical. I want to make it to disambiguate and know these are exactly the entities being referred to in that claim coming from there. And
so that's interesting to me because I'm not sure in your context here what indexical looks like. Is it just a sentence unattached to, I mean, is it a sentence in the middle of other sentences and unattached to like topics, concepts, entities? Or is it?
Okay, the correct question. I'm saying, I'm envisioning a process whereby somebody will take a text, take a sentence within that text, and this is pure text, sentence is pure text, and say, okay, I think this is an interesting claim. I want to enter it in the system. Now,
so it's a pure text that came from a document, basically.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. Now, and there's a process whereby we say,
at a certain position within the document, right?
Exactly. Yeah. It's a precise utterance with provenance and everything.
Right.
And I want to ask, what does that mean? Can we make this into a good non-indexical? It needs to be translated. It needs to be transformed into a non-indexical.
Yeah, and there absolutely, that's where interpretation comes in, right? Yes, I understand. Mm-hmm.
Yeah. And what I'm saying is, in some cases, some of the entities in that claim will be well-defined entities, such as you and me in that document, right? That's fine. But some of them will be vague concepts. And then what we know about the vague concepts for the purpose of disambiguation is basically all the constraints on the concepts given by all the other claims in the document. And I'm saying it's very hard to pinpoint one meaning, one interpretation of the concept. It is, well, there's some stuff that is known to be consensus about that phrase, and there's some stuff that is known to be non-consensus about that phrase, and we can start with the consensus stuff, but there's all these shades of meaning that come from every other claim in the document that say, well, I think the author means this by this phrase, right? And you'll come from another document and it'll be another set of inferences. And is there, how do we go from these cloudy things to saying, well, this phrase has these and these and these discrete interpretations as opposed to cloudy interpretations, more or less, or these are the ones that are discrete enough to be interesting, and it's this transition that is difficult.
So yeah, what's interesting about this, the new perspective you've given me on this is, and this is one of those places where I can flip it on its head and make the canonical debate the main driver here. You know, I look for it from the perspective of canonical debate, where you know the lockdown example is a claim, but it's a claim that we generally agree would benefit from formalized structures that help with the managing of that debate, rather than just like having copy paste 100 different variations on same supporting arguments and everything, right? So there's a category of debate that might be comparison, and there's a category of claim that might be, what do you call it, variable, things like that. And so I see this as, in some way, what you're talking about is another formalized structure that helps with claims around interpretation, right? Where part of that advanced structure is in some way a concept of interpretations of all the other claims in a document and how they relate to each other. So you can propose saying they're talking about this, and that means these claims all have to mean this thing. And here's another interpretation where they're talking about this and all these other claims. And like you said, each interpretation constrains how you can interpret the others. Yeah, I see that. Very complicated, but I see that. I see, yeah, interesting. Yeah.
I mean, my goal is to be able to represent discourse. So, yep, nothing in the complexity of discourse is out of scope for me, unfortunately.
Yeah. Right. I mean, part of the mismatch or disagreements are on, you know, emphasis on priority, right, of the problems you want to solve. Where you focus a lot, you work a lot within interpretations, and I just want to know the factual answers of, is this thing true or not, or is, you know, political and scientific truth, policy, that sort of thing. Yeah. Interesting.
No, I've observed too many misunderstandings based on conflicting interpretations of key terms. And that's why it's a focus for me. Of course, there's also this, you know, real world disagreements based on interpretation of facts and agreement on facts, and more of those actually. But I still think interpretation is a huge.
Well, you know, also differences in priorities and fear of complexity creep, right? This thing will never get implemented if we try to encompass everything.
Perfectly valid concern, and I am terrified by my own perspective also. But on the other hand, I've also seen systems fail because they did not tackle those issues. And that's why I'm
Which is my point that, you know, our starting point has to be better than Chialo, right?
Yep.
But as we go, I know already there's lots of things that are high on my priority of types of claims that, you know, the policy claims that do we do this or that. No, I mean, there's a whole scope we haven't even gotten to, which is a decision making type.
Yep, absolutely.
Trade-offs and that sort of thing. But at any rate, yeah. Part of the creep is, until we solve this problem, we'll have to scrap everything and start over as soon as we bump into this issue.
Yeah.
I have to go to my.
Yeah, I think it's fine. I had part of the conversation I wanted. I think this was useful.
We didn't get into the low-level design questions you had. I need to understand better frame so I can help think through this more. But
it's very much you know, here's a situation and here are the actors in that situation. It's and playing these roles. So think of it as there's a frame type and there's named roles and actors playing those roles. But what I'm saying here is that a lot of the actors are not so much entities as entity variables. And this is where I may actually be already differing. I need to reread Minsky to see how he saw it. Because
we'll have to get into, I have to go to my meeting, but we'll have to get into more concrete examples so I can fully piece it all together.
Okay.
Or maybe rewatching the beginning of this video here might do it for me.
Yeah. Felix, I have some more time if you want to, if you have something to add to this. Ciao, ciao.
Bye, guys.
Bye, Tim. Yes, Marc-Antoine. Sure. Do you have any more questions?
Well,
I'd say like let's do 15 minutes more if you like.
Do you have things to add, or do you have perspectives to add to what I said?
Not really. Like I agree that it's necessary if you want to do it right. But I also understand like the scope of the canonical debate, that it's like some things are partly out of scope.
Fair enough.
And I'd like to support you both because both things are worth it, I think.
Yeah. The one reason I'm working on this, but one reason I'm insisting so much of interpretations is it's very much in Jamie's scope. Like she's working with real world sentences and what is meant by that, and what do we and trying to discretize interpretations, and that's a core scope for her and for me. But I agree in terms of like right now what I'm thinking is making a first toy version that doesn't do any formalization, that speaks only at the language level, but has this many-to-many, here's a claim, here's interpretations. The interpretations are also expressed as text, but let's do this many-to-many correspondence to see what it looks like. Here's a claim with provenance, and here's an interpretation that's supposed to be more abstract. And let's postpone. But I am thinking, since everything is to be built on frames, and I still, in the future, the question is, can I build this over a frame system? And is it easy to make a basic frame system for that? And I'm looking a bit at frame system and implementations, because from a database standpoint, what it needs is to use only one sequence, right? So that the identifiers are shared between all tables.
True. Or you use UUIDs.
Or you use UUID.
Then you don't.
Or you use SHA-256. Or you.
Yeah, right. So there are ways.
What? There are ways. But now that I've realized, I may have full recursion with a kind of two-pronged, like here's the frame entity, which could be, for example, as SHA-256, and the role slot. This is actually quite simple. There's not that many role slots. I even thought, okay, I could have one table with all frames, but one index per frame type slot name there.
Yeah.
It's not that hard to build.
But you might be thinking too relational for this, and it might hurt a bit in your whole design, because it should be an event stream in the future, right?
Of course.
And now you're trying to model it in a relational database, which might make things more difficult than they actually are.
Okay, why am I thinking in relational databases? A, because I know them intimately, and I think there's all kinds of other databases that are really good, but very few databases give you the level of control over indexes that Postgres gives you, or some of the best relational databases. So I can put things in any which way in Postgres and then say, okay, let me declare this index, and let me declare this index, and let me declare this index. And I can fine tune the indexing in Postgres in a way I cannot do in, for example, Mongo or Neo4j or all kinds of other stuff. If I decide that, hey, this relation creates equivalence classes, well, there's a very specific kind of structure I can build for equivalence class indexing, which has nothing to do with, and that wouldn't even be an index. It would have to be another table, but yep. I can decide to create that and create an index over it and blah, 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 in a way that I wouldn't with, I wouldn't know how to do that with most other databases. And I think it's impossible with most other databases I'm aware of.
Yeah, I mean, it's not impossible. It's just more work. It's just like you have to build the indexes yourself and create them yourself, which is like usually not what you want to do.
Yeah.
But like, don't get me wrong. I'm also coming from relational databases, and I'm thinking a lot in a relational way.
I understand. I'm thinking, what can I do fast right now I have a need for a first implementation, as it turns out, to play with. And what can I do fastest? Relational.
Absolutely, but try to have a simple relational model.
Yes. Abstract. Yes, I agree with that.
Don't try to model too much, like as you said, like, oh, I can control the indexes and everything.
No, that's for
don't
later.
Do that in the beginning. Do that only when there's performance consideration.
I agree. There, I agree with you. Make it work well, make it work fast. There, you're absolutely right. But I do think that having ways to, I'm basically creating this notion of entity reference as individual frame ID plus role as for the variables, and just the frame identity otherwise. And what is cute is that many of the individuals, now of course some of them will be documents, for example, or immutables, and that's fine. But for the mutables, they're just the entity variable of the naming process, which that was a great insight I had recently. I'm really happy with, because it allows me to not distinguish frames and entities.
Try to build a very simple system, and then I'm happy to look at it.
Okay. Thanks.
But don't try. Try to not waste any time on things that you know are like premature optimization. It's mostly about like a very simple design that works.
Yeah.
That can express everything you want to.
Yeah.
Good.
I'll talk to you more soon, and we'll have that.
And would you mind trying the whole video thing I set up?
Okay.
There will be a Slack message that says, okay, video is uploaded to YouTube. Now you just have to do this.
I'll try it, not at once, but I'll try it. It will be later, much later in the afternoon, but I'll do it.
Yeah, that's fine.
Okay.
Okay. Thank you, Marc-Antoine. Have a great weekend.
You too.
Bye.